Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Healthy Alternatives Podcast. I'm Dr. Janet Starr Hull. I'm the author of Sweet Poison. I am an aspartame researcher and an aspartame expert. And I am presenting to you today a podcast on why we have known for 50 years that aspartame causes cancer. It is a part of my Aspartame Files series, and we're going to start you off going through the very rocky 1970s as GD Searle Pharmaceuticals was first applying for its patents to put aspartame onto the consumer market. I found it very interesting in July of 2023 that the WHO made the announcement that aspartame causes cancer. What? I thought, we've known this for 50 years. Why, after 50 years, would the WHO decide to make this announcement? I found it extremely odd and very curious. I also found it very curious that they didn't have another sugar substitute replacement for aspartame. So to make an announcement like this and not have an immediate replacement for aspartame, I thought that was also very odd and very curious. And now, a couple months after this announcement had been made, we don't hear anything about it on any social media or mainstream news. So what's going on here? My good friend and one of the original aspartame researchers, Dr. Woody Monty, feels that because there are so many distractions out there, from climate change to GMOs to laboratory meats and to the debate about COVID, he believes that consumers are so distracted that if this issue is just no longer talked about, it will be forgotten by the consumer, and aspartame will continue to be used in diet colas and diet products. I think he's right. It had been suppressed and hidden successfully for 50 years. I do not know why they decided to make the announcement, but it appears that it's going to continue to be suppressed and forgotten about for the years to come. So what I'm wanting to do with my Aspartame Files series is I want to bring back the history of aspartame, the approval history of aspartame, the proof from the research scientists that aspartame indeed causes cancer. And I want to bring back to the present a past that has been hidden and suppressed from the consumer. Aspartame is a toxic food substance. It is a very dangerous sweetener to be using. It does cause cancer, and it does cause other health disease syndromes too. So I'm going to begin today by giving you a brief history of how aspartame was discovered, and then we're going to start on the journey of how aspartame got approved as a known carcinogen and how it has been allowed to be in the food supply today. Okay, so in 1965, GD Searle Pharmaceuticals was in the laboratory researching a new ulcer medication. The research scientist typically knocked his papers off of his desk or table, licked his fingers, reached down to pick up his paperwork, and realized, wow, this medication is really sweet. Either at the coffee bar or going out to lunch with someone in GD Searle's upper management, somehow his discovery was shared with some influencers in GD Searle, and they'd made a very smart decision, actually. They thought to themselves, we could market a calorie-free, very simple to make artificial sweetener. Aspartame only has 3 ingredients in it: the amino acid phenylalanine, the amino acid aspartic acid, And those two amino acids are bonded together by 10% methanol. That's it. So they decided that they were going to change the paperwork and they were going to remove applying for FDA approval for a new drug and simply switch it and relabel it to applying with the FDA for a new food additive. And then they began to put into place marketing aspartame. Now, at this time, the Monsanto Chemical Company owned the patent to sweeten low, or saccharin. Saccharin had been out since 1902, and saccharin wasn't a big moneymaker. They had tried it in Tab and Fresca diet colas. It really didn't take off. They were promoting it for diabetes. That really didn't take off. And so GD Searle thought, okay, this is really great. We can give them a run for their money. Let's see if we can take over the market. Let's see if we can change the diet industry. And guess what they did? But they did this with the knowledge all along that aspartame was unsafe for human consumption and that it did cause cancer. So that gives you a brief history of how aspartame was discovered. And now we're going to get into the beginnings of the push to get aspartame approved. So I'm going to put on my professorial glasses here and I'm going to read my notes to make sure that I don't miss anything. All right, so when they did put aspartame or apply and get their patent together for application for approval through the FDA, this was in the 1970s, and they knew that aspartame might not get approved, and they knew that they had some serious problems with proving that aspartame was safe as a diet sweetener. Actually, aspartame almost got scrapped because they knew that it was causing brain tumors and cancer. Yep, that's right. As early as 1970, every ethical scientist and researcher on this planet knew that aspartame caused cancer. But even though GD Searle had a big problem, they just kept pushing to get aspartame approved. So in the 1970s, things really got started. They applied for patent, and the independent researchers picked up that this was going on. The GD Searle researchers were submitting paperwork that aspartame was perfectly safe, and the independent researchers, mostly medical doctors at medical schools and at universities throughout the United States, were submitting research that their laboratory results were showing cancer and holes in the brains of their laboratory animals. So what we're looking at here is a sweetener war beginning in the 1970s on aspartame safety. In 1970, Dr. John Olney was a research psychologist in the Department of Psychiatry at Washington School of Medicine, and he was one of the very first researchers that got involved in trying to prevent aspartame from being approved with the FDA. He began his studies on the safety of aspartame, concerned that this ulcer drug turned sweetener was not a healthy product for the open market. Olney's suspicions were proven correct when his laboratory mice developed lesions in their brains. That's pretty creepy, guys, pretty creepy. So in 1971, Dr. Olney did the right thing. He went to GD Searle, and he showed them his research results, and he explained to them that the aspartic acid in aspartame caused holes to form in the brains of his test mice. Well, Ann Reynolds was a researcher hired by GD Searle to investigate Dr. Olney's findings, hopefully to dispute them. And she could not find anything inaccurate with them. All right. Reynolds confirmed that her findings matched Dr. Olney's findings. But this didn't stop G.D. Searle. And they continued to push aspartame as the latest and greatest new diet sweetener. So in 1973, G.D. Searle petitioned the FDA for approval for aspartame use in all foods. So Dr. Olney and Washington, D.C. Attorney Jim Turner met with G.D. Searle again to discuss Olney's research again, but their safety concerns came to no avail. They pushed forward with their approval from the FDA for use in foods, and in 1974, G.D. Searle presented their research to the FDA Commissioner Alexander Schmidt, MD, a medical doctor who was in charge of approving aspartame. Well, he did approve it, but for only dry goods. Dr. Olney and Attorney Turner then met with Commissioner Schmidt in D.C. and presented to him Dr. Olney's findings. This time, their safety concerns did get some attention. So that was in 1974. In 1975, Commissioner Schmidt put together an FDA task force to investigate aspartame safety. Here he had his research from G.D. Searle showing that this application for a new diet sweetener was perfectly safe. And here they had the research from Dr. John Olney proving that aspartame caused holes to form in the brains of his laboratory mice. So they did the right thing. And you know, that's really refreshing. In 1975, the FDA was actually doing the right thing. So they formed this task force, and they hired one of the leading toxicologists and food chemical investigators, Philip Brodsky, who also hired toxicologist Adrian Gross, who was a medical doctor, to head this task force. Both were charged with examining the original lab materials submitted by G.D. Searle and Dr. Olney's studies. After several months of investigation, this task force submitted a 15,000-page document with an 85-page summary. They reported that the problems they found throughout G.D. Searle's studies revealed a pattern of conduct that compromised the scientific integrity of the studies. So in essence, the FDA concluded that G.D. Searle's studies were flawed, that they were not accurate, and they rescinded the approval for aspartame. They took it away. This wasn't the first time that G.D. Searle had submitted an application for approval on a drug that was questionable, and their approval had been rescinded and questioned many times before. But it was really good that they had rescinded this first aspartame approval request. So in 1976, as a result of the task force investigation, there was a U.S. Senate subcommittee hearing called on April 8th, 1976. Okay, so what we're looking at here is just like today, with the safety of vaccines, the safety of any application that's going in front of the FDA. When we have something questionable like this, they are going to form a task force to research it. I believe today they may call it a special counsel. Okay? Alrighty. So they, at this time, began to look at all of the research that had been presented in as early as the 1973. What's really interesting, though, at this time, and we're talking 1976, Tate and Lyle, which is a British sugar company in London, they began searching for ways to blend sucrose, pure sugar, with laboratory chemicals. Now, Tate and Lyle is the company that discovered and first marketed sucralose, which, when brought to the United States, was labeled Splenda. Now, Splenda came to the United States. It was brought over here and patented to be sold in the United States by the Maricent Company as Splenda in the year 2000. But what's interesting is that Tate and Lyle began research on discovering a product which they called sucralose in 1976. Well, that tells me that there was some politics going on behind the scenes then, too. So in 1977, the political influences started to pick up. What we're looking at here is now the FDA, our protective government agency, picked up on the fact that aspartame was not safe for public consumption, something G.D. Searle was suspecting would happen, but they kept pushing despite Dr. John Olney's research studies and despite their own in-house research studies proving seizures and cancer caused by aspartame. For some reason, they weren't going to give it up, and they kept pushing and kept pushing hard. So in 1977, the politics began to pick up. A five-member task force, a new task force was formed. And this task force was headed by FDA Inspector Jerome Bresler. He was given 15 seral aspartame studies to look at, to examine. He discovered in just these 15 studies that some of the test animals had developed cancerous uterine tumors, and he determined that the blood tests had been tampered with. But like I previously said, this was not new for G.D. Searle. They had been investigated and questioned many times before on pulling these stunts with medications that they had approved. Alrighty, according to Bresler's report, and it is called the Bresler Report. It is in my book, Sweet Poison. Dr. Woody Monty also has it. It's online, and I also have it online in my records as well. Searle claimed that they experienced problems with their instruments, and therefore they substituted the results of some studies with other test results. Have we not been hearing about some of this going on today? Yep. Also in 1977, a Rockville, Maryland firm examined 12 out of those 15 seral aspartame studies, and they found written accounts of cancerous brain tumors that had not been officially reported. So beginning in January of 1977, so the very first month of January 1977, FDA Chief Counsel Richard Merrill formally requested that U.S. Attorney Samuel Skinner conduct a grand jury investigation on the tests submitted to the FDA by G.D. Searle. Again, what are we looking at today? This pattern hasn't changed. We've got G.D. Searle submitting flawed stories, test results, tampered Paperwork, we have the FDA forming task force to look into the credibility of the paperwork that was submitted. And the investigation was based on whether GD Searle, a pharmaceutical company, concealed material facts and made false statements in animal study reports concerning the safety of aspartame. We're seeing this today concerning the safety of vaccines. Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed over the past 50 years. At this time, the FDA cited 2 specific aspartame studies needing special attention. One was a primate study where the monkeys suffered seizures, but they were never given autopsies. And back then, they were doing studies on guinea pigs and rhesus monkeys, because the rhesus monkeys and the guinea pigs were more like the human being because they do not produce vitamin C in their liver. Primates, guinea pigs, and humans do not produce vitamin C in the liver. Mice do. So when studies are performed on mice, it's not really a one-to-one comparison with the human reaction. But sorry, I digress. All right, so at this time, the 2 studies that were given special attention were, 1 on the primates suffering seizures and not having autopsies, and 2, the second was on a toxicity study on hamsters. Attorney Skinner, who was in charge of the investigation, removed himself from the case in March. So we're talking U.S. Attorney General got on the case in January. He removed himself in March to accept a position with G.D. Searle's law firm, Sidley & Austin. Sidley & Austin had been hired by G.D. Searle to represent them against the FDA and against any lawsuits that are going to come up against them submitting fraudulent documents. So our U.S. Attorney General, who was heading this case for the FDA, representing the FDA and the U.S. government, went to work for G.D. Searle's law firm. So William Conlon, Senior Assistant U.S. Attorney, was then appointed the U.S. Attorney. Conlon took no action. He slowed walked the aspartame case. And then he accepted a position with Sidley and Austin later that same year. Okay. Thomas Sullivan was then appointed U.S. Attorney, and he also took no action in the aspartame investigations. He allowed the statute of limitations for a grand jury investigation to expire. So, a grand jury investigation to prosecute this case was allowed to expire by the U.S. Attorney in December of 1977, that same year. So, from the whole year of 1977, the investigation was slow-walked, nothing was done. The U.S. attorneys went to work for G.D. Searle's law firms. They did nothing and allowed any prosecution for wrongdoing to expire. Now we get into some names that may be a little more familiar to you. Donald Rumsfeld, former congressman and chief of staff in the Ford administration, was hired as G.D. Searle's president. He immediately hired 3 other government officials, John Robson, Robert Shapiro, and William Greener, Jr. John Robson was hired as executive vice president of G.D. Searle, and he was a former lawyer with Sidley and Austin, and he served as chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board for the government, working with the U.S. Department of Transportation. Robert Shapiro was hired as G.D. Searle's general counsel, And he soon became the first director of the new NutraSweet company. Shapiro was Robson's special assistant at the U.S. Department of Transportation. William Greener Jr. was hired as Searles' chief spokesman. He was former spokesman for the Ford administration. So what we're looking at in 1977 is the formation of a revolving door. And that revolving door is still revolving today. We've got government officials that go to work for the law firms that represent the corporations that are being investigated by the government agencies, who continue to go from law firm to corporation to government agency. So that revolving door is still revolving, and here we see it revolving in 1977. So in 1978, to counter back, the research began to ramp up. I'm telling you, people, this was when the FDA, as a government agency representing the health and safety of United States citizens, were trying to do their job. They were trying to do their job. And this was a time when research scientists, typically MD, PhD researchers, were doing their job and were allowed to do their job. They were doing good research, follow the science. They were coming out with good results, documented results, results that needed to be looked at, talked about, and seriously considered to not allow toxic substances to be released into the public food supply. So back then we saw things, they were trying to do them right. We were still trying to respect the good science, and this was the good science. So the research ramped up. We already had Dr. John Olney's studies. We had Dr. Woody Monte's studies, and he's got an excellent book where his studies are in detail called While Science Sleeps. Dr. Monte and I are working together on the aspartame files, and you can go onto YouTube and onto my website at janethull.com, and you can hear an incredible interview that I did with Dr. Monte on how he got into this research and the experiences that he has had fighting the pharmaceutical companies and trying to get the government agencies to do the right thing. Okay, so in 1978, the research ramps up. Northeastern Illinois University Department of Psychology submitted a study on aspartame. They documented the following research results: reproductive dysfunction in both male and female test animals, endocrine dysfunction, including within the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the ovaries, and the testes. They discovered an increase in weight in their laboratory animals fed aspartame diet sweetener. And they documented a decrease in locomotor function. Then they presented their research, and of course I'm just picking out one. There were research studies going on all over the place, and they were being submitted to the FDA. So aspartame proceedings continued. They were held at the National Academy of Sciences. Research was presented there showing elevated blood phenylalanine levels, and this affected the fetuses of mothers who carried the PKU gene. Now, PKU is phenylketonuria, and it is a rare abnormality in the growing fetus that results in a lower IQ and possibly death, because the fetus cannot properly process and assimilate the amino acid phenylalanine. It's called phenylketonuria, or PKU. What was interesting, to get into the weeds again a little bit, when aspartame was finally approved in 1981, which I'll go into in the next podcast for the aspartame files, for aspartame's final approval, it was decided that because of the risk of fetal damage in mothers who carried the PKU gene, they had to put a warning, caution, contains phenylalanine on the packages that had aspartame in it. And today, after aspartame lost its patent and now is prolific out there, anybody can make it, anybody can sell it, anybody can market it, it's no longer on the packaging. And actually, aspartame is no longer listed on many packages as sugar-free. It's in fat-free. It's in products that aren't labeled sugar-free. So you have to turn over and read the ingredient label for aspartame. And then there is no caution, PKU contains phenylalanine. So the information, the truth, the data, the good science is now forgotten. It's now getting buried, and I'm bringing it back. Okay, so here we go. All right. So now we're up to 1979, and we're almost done, guys, but this is really important information for you to know and to remember. In 1979, we now had to have political crowd control because the scientists weren't stopping. The scientists knew how dangerous aspartame is. So the scientists continued to pound this. G.D. Searle continued to pound its approval. And now they had infiltrated into the political uppers at the top of the political decision making. So now the politics had to try to control these research scientists. So now we're back to U.S. Attorney Tom Sullivan. He submitted a formal statement to the FDA stating that his reasons for not prosecuting G.D. Searle for other drugs of concern, he gave the reasons for that, but he made no mention of aspartame when he made a presentation defending G.D. Searle, defending the approval of other medications and drugs. The copper 7 IUD is one as an example, and aldacone is another one. Several independent studies on aspartame were performed, and as reported in Science magazine, these studies linked methanol, the 10% of aspartame, to fetal alcohol syndrome and to diminished cognitive capacity. Now, this is Dr. Monte's wheelhouse. He really focused on the methanol. Dr. Olney focused on the aspartic acid, and various other research scientists focused on the phenylalanine and the PKU connection. But Dr. Monte focused on the methanol. His research is extremely interesting because, yes, he connects aspartame to cancer, he connects aspartame to MS, and of course he was the one behind the connection of fetal alcohol syndrome and lower IQ. In 1979, the New England Journal of Medicine published a study showing a high incidence of birth defects as a result of elevated phenylalanine levels in the PKU women exposed to aspartame during pregnancy. The FDA requested a review of the objections to aspartame approval. Routinely, you'll have judges, administrative law judges, hold public hearings. But in this case, interestingly, the FDA suggested a public board of inquiry be assembled using scientists as opposed to judges. So the board was impaneled, and that story begins in the 1980s, the subject for the next Aspartame Files podcast. I've got a little bit more to cover, but my main point here is this was a very rocky 10 years for a product that was supposedly safe. This was a very rocky 10 years for a product that is still on the market. It had been denied FDA approval twice before it was finally approved in 1981. And its approval is also extremely interesting. So that's a real good story to tell that I'll go into in the next podcast. But people, my point is this. We have known that aspartame causes cancer for 50 years. We still see it on the market today. The research scientists that saw the holes in the brains of their laboratory mice saw what they saw. They knew what they knew. It was good science. That was the science that we needed to follow. So many research scientists have now passed on. Dr. Monty and I are going to take up this topic again and bring it to you so that you can know that this information is not new. It has been proven. And if you don't mind, bear with me. I'm going to go through a little bit more to just bring you up to today. Okay? Today, the government agencies, such as the CDC, maintain that the causes of fetal deformities and cancerous tumors, seizures, and an increase in diabetes. They claim that these are not related to aspartame use. Until 2023, when the WHO made the announcement that aspartame causes cancer, they have denied, not just ignored, but denied the fact that they knew this. Okay? In 1987, Dr. Louis Alsus from Emory University Medical School, he provided proof in 1987 to a U.S. Senate subcommittee that aspartame is a proven cause of fetal deformity. We will go into this in more detail when we talk about the 1980s, but know that it's there. He also presented to them that it resulted in mental retardation and birth defects in his studies. He told senators this. He testified at another Senate subcommittee, and we'll go into this in more detail as well when we talk about the Senate subcommittee hearings in 1987. I have a YouTube video out about the 2005 Disclose study from Greece by Dr. Stylianos Disclose at the University of Athens. He proved aspartame causes memory loss and learning impairment. According to this study, aspartame will eventually lead to the downregulation of postsynaptic ACH receptors. And what this means is that ultimately it will disrupt memory and learning. And we're seeing an increase in Alzheimer's. Yeah. Children are being dumbed down in schools these days. Yeah. If you don't have memory issues now, but you regularly use diet sweeteners, I would say that this study proves that over time your memory can be damaged and ultimately disrupted. In 2014, there was an Israeli study that was done proving that aspartame disrupts the healthy bacteria in your gut. And this disrupts normal blood sugar and insulin production. So in 2014, this study proved that aspartame consumption can lead to diabetes. So if you are type 2, if you're watching your diet and adjusting your diet, adult onset, juvenile onset diabetes, or even if you're type 1 and you are using aspartame, it's not going to make you any healthier. It can make it worse. And if you are type 2, it can cause type 1. According to a 2014 University of Iowa study, healthy postmenopausal women, older women, drinking two or more diet drinks a day increase their risk of heart disease, including heart attack and stroke. So people, this is still going on. There's still the research study going on, even though we have a look over here, shiny object distraction with other issues that are happening in today's world. But what I want to remind you of is we have had this toxin in our food supply for a very long time. We are fighting a ghost. I mean, this information has been suppressed from you. It's been hidden from social media. It's been kept away from you. So whether you're pregnant, whether you have a child, whether you're elderly, whether you have an illness, whether you've been taking vaccines, whatever, aspartame use can harm your health. So thank you very much for joining me today. This is Dr. Janet Hull. Please join me on janethull.com. Please continue to support my Healthy Alternative podcasts. Email me anytime, and we'll see you soon. Thank you for joining me today.